Okay, Pirkei Avos, Mishnah Chof, depending on which layout you have. So it's the 20th Mishnah of chapter 4. And this is a Mishnah, I always talk about the fact that there are different layouts of the Perek, and then the Mishnah is divided differently depending on which. That's what we call Girsa, right? There's different Girsa'os, different versions. This might well be the Mishnah that has the most different Girsa'os about how you're supposed to read it. So it's a Mishnah in 3 parts. The first part is attributed to the person who's going to be the most interesting of the 3 people for us to look at today. And so the first part of the Mishnah is attributed to this individual we'll talk about in a moment. The second part of the Mishnah is attributed to a lesser known one of the Tanoim. And the third part of the Mishnah is a matter of Girsa, who exactly said it. There are 2 versions of who said the last part of the Mishnah. So that's the first indication that there's something unusual about this Mishnah, that it's got these various versions associated with it. Now again, depending on which text you have in front of you, will also determine the words of the Mishnah. There are 2 versions about how the first 2 of the 3 segments of this Mishnah are supposed to work. And the 2 different versions obviously have completely different perspectives, even though they're on the same theme. So there's quite a lot of nuance to this particular Mishnah. Let's start at the beginning. The first thing that should catch your eye right at the beginning of this Mishnah is the fact that the sage who starts the Mishnah is not referred to with a title. Now, earlier on in history, like in the first Perek, the first chapter of Pirkei Avos, when we spoke about such great individuals as Hillel and Shammai, Shemaiah and Avtalion, they were not given the title rabbi. The Gemara says that the reason for that is because there's a certain hierarchy. The hierarchy is Rav. Well, actually, Rav was only in the time of the Gemara. That was a title that was only used in the time of the Gemara after the Jews had been expelled or had left Israel after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. The Gemara says, greater than Rav is somebody who is called Rabbi, like Rabbi Akiba or Rabbi Mayer. That constitutes somebody who's got higher authority, is considered a greater sage. Greater than that is somebody who's called Rabbon, like Rabbon Gamliel. That indicates somebody who's one of the greatest of all the sages. And then the Gemara says, Gadol mi Rabbon Shmoi. The highest level that you could get at that period in time was to be called just by name without a title, like Hillel and Shammai. However, the individual we're going to read about in this Mishnah does not have the word rabbi before his name, and it's not a compliment. And this is the rabbi known as Elisha ben Avuya. That's how he's called in the Mishnah, Elisha ben Avuya. Now, elsewhere in the Gemara, in multiple places in the Gemara, they don't even refer to him by name. They only refer to him by the title Acher, which is not a very complimentary way to refer to somebody. Acher is like someone else, somebody we don't want to name. As people say, he who shall not be named. Acher, somebody else. Now, in order to know the story of this Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya and how he came to be called Acher and what this has to do with what we're going to learn over here today, it's quite relevant because if, for whatever reason it's not a compliment that he's not called by the title rabbi and he's given this other nickname, which is a non-complimentary nickname, you do wonder then why we quote him. Surely you prefer to quote the people who are the best sages, the exemplary individuals. So we have to examine that as well. So here's the story, or at least part of the story. The story is, the Gemara tells us, Arba'a nichnasu lepardes, that there were 4 individuals, 4 sages, who entered into paradise. Now, we know the story, right? You know the story. Paradise is a metaphor. The direct translation of paradise is an orchard, but it's a metaphor. It means that they delved into some very advanced, deep, mystical experience. Out of the 4 sages, 3 of them were badly harmed by their experience. So what happened to them? Ben Azai says Ben Azai, and that's why he's not called by the name Rabbi, and he's not even referred to by his first name. Ben Azai experienced the spiritual exposure, and it blew his mind, and he went meshuggah. Benzoma, he was exposed to this deep mystical experience, and he died. Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya, or as he's called in the Mishnah and in the Gemara, just Elisha ben Avuya, says that he saw the kitzeitz benetios, which is a very kind of euphemistic way of saying that as a result of this experience, he actually went off the derech. He dropped his Judaism. The last thing that you'd expect from a deep mystical experience, right? That it pushed him in the opposite direction and he became a heretic. Kitzeitz benetios. It means almost like he pecked at the plantings, like uprooted the plants. Rabbi Akiba is the only one who survived. And the Gemara tells us how he survived. It says, Nichnas b'shalom v'yotza b'shalom. He entered into this experience in peace, and therefore he was able to leave this experience in peace. Now that's very important to us, because that basically tells us that it has everything to do with how you start a process that will determine how the process ends up. So Rabbi Akiba went into this mystical experience with the right intentions, and therefore he was able to come out whole and solid. Now, here's an interesting little play on words that gives us insight into this particular story. There are certain words that, if you jumble the letters, go from meaning something extremely positive to meaning something extremely negative. For example, we can actually use the board for this. So, if you take the word oineg is enjoyment or pleasure, right? Shabbos is the day of oineg, of pleasure and enjoyment. So it's the same letters as the word nega. What's nega? A wound or a blemish. So if a person approaches something with the right approach, they get the oineg, they get the value and the benefit and the pleasure out of it. And if they approach the same thing and it's not with the right approach, then they get the nega, they get harmed by it. So that's what happened to Ben Azai. He went into this mystical experience, which is supposed to be such wonderful oineg, to have the pleasure of experiencing godliness, and instead what happened is Nega, he was harmed, and he came out of it having lost his mind. Okay, so that's the one. The other is, if you take the word, how do you say something is complete or sincere in Hebrew? Shalom is one word. Another word, that shalom is very much about complete, but if you had to use the word that also means sincere, could also mean simple. Tum, right? Like the four sons. Okay, so you got the word tum. So tum implies that something is a simple experience, as in you don't overcomplicate it with your own brain. It also implies that it's a whole experience. So there's only one way you can jumble up these letters, and that gives you mace, to die, God forbid. So that's what happened to benzoma. So benzoma had the opportunity to experience tum, to experience this perfect mystical experience, but unfortunately it didn't go that way, and instead mace, he landed up passing away. And then the third one is the word keser. What's keser? Crown. Keser is a crown. And often when we speak about mystical concepts, we speak about the keser, that this is like the crown of Torah. Now if you jumble up those letters, the letters of keser, what negative words do you get out of that? Kores, right? So you get kores. Kores means to be cut off, spiritual excision. And that's what happened to Elisha ben Avuya. So he had this opportunity to engage the keser, the crown of Hashem, and unfortunately, having approached it wrong, he landed up with kores, being cut off from the community. Rabbi Akiba had all three benefits. He landed up with the tum, the oineg, and the keser, because nichnas b'shalom v'yotza b'shalom, he went in a peaceful or in an appropriate way, and he came out in an appropriate way. So though it's not directly related to our Mishnah, because it's so fascinating to understand what went wrong with Elisha ben Avuya, let's try to understand what happened over here. How is it possible that a person could expose themselves to such amazing, mystical, esoteric, spiritual experiences, and then it just blows up in the face, and the next day the person's eating non-kosher and hanging out with the inappropriate people? In fact, that's how he got his name, Acher. Just picture the scene. Picture the scene. He has this famous rabbi, and the next thing he knocks on the door of a house of ill repute. So the woman in charge says to him, "What are you doing here? You're the great rabbi. You don't belong here." And it happened to be on a Shabbos, noch, on top of everything else. So he did something in front of her to show that he no longer observed Shabbos. And then he said, I am acher, I'm somebody else. I'm not the great rabbi who you used to know. And that's how the nickname stuck. And he became known as acher. So you've got to work out how somebody who's of the caliber that they can enter this paradise, how does this happen to them? Now, when you see a story such as this, you can understand all those things that people say, don't learn Kabbalah until you're 40 years old. He may well have been well over 40 at the time of the story, for all we know. And you can understand the warning of the Rambam, if you've ever read what the Rambam writes in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, where he speaks about the foundational beliefs of Judaism. So he describes that there are two things. There's what's called Maisa Bereshis and Maisa Merkava. The workings, the machinations of creation. And Maisa Merkava, the secrets of the so-called divine chariot, which are expressed in the visions of Yecheskel and Yeshaya. So he says, based on the Gemara, that Maisa Bereshis, the secrets of how creation works, that you could teach to an individual, one person at a time, provided that they're qualified to be able to learn it. But Maisa Merkava, the secrets of what goes on in the spiritual realms, that's off limits, unless it's somebody who could actually work it out on their own, and then you guide them through the process. How's that for a thought? You don't even teach it. He says you don't teach it to anybody. Only if there's somebody who naturally is inclined and you can see that they understand these things, then you can guide them through it. And then the Gemara goes into a whole thing on the subject about different individuals and how they started to teach Maisa Merkava, and crazy things started to happen, fire coming out of the sky and all that kind of thing. So you get the impression you shouldn't be doing this. And yet here we have 4 sages who attempted the experience of the paradise, and only one of them got it right. So let's try and work it out. What do you think is the danger of Kabbalah? Let's try and work this out between us. What's so dangerous? What, you're going to make a goylem and you're not going to know how to switch it off? You know, it's going to parade through the street and, I don't know, loot and break cars. I don't know. What's going to happen? What are we worried about? What's the problem with mysticism? You can't understand it. So what's wrong with that? If you can't... so you get the wrong idea, right? What happens if a person learns Kabbalah and they get the wrong idea? Now, if you open up the Torah, right at the beginning of the Torah, what does it say? It says, and Hashem said, Na'aseh Adam, let us make man. So straight away, the Gemara asks the question, look at that. You've just opened a possibility for people to make one of the most critical mistakes in the whole of history, to think that maybe there's some other power that Hashem confers with. So what's the Gemara's answer? If a person wants to get the information wrong, let them get it wrong. Now that's a fundamental principle about one God, which is foundational to the whole of Judaism. And we don't start telling people, don't learn the beginning of Bereshis because you might get the wrong idea. So how come it is that when it comes to mysticism, now we're worried? Now we're concerned that someone's going to get the wrong idea. And it's going to be so dangerous. What's so dangerous? What's so dangerous about it? It's not pshat. And if a person gets the pshat wrong, what happens? Whatever happens if a person learns Shulchan Aruch and they misunderstand the Shulchan Aruch and now they behave in a way that is against Judaism and they think they've understood it. Is that not worse? What's the danger? So let's have a look at the 4 individuals and their experience, and then we'll understand exactly what the danger is. So let's start with Ben Azai. Okay, Ben Azai goes crazy. What does it mean he goes crazy? What does it mean if a person goes crazy? How do you know if somebody goes crazy? Who's to decide if somebody's crazy? What do you think happened? He started telling everybody he was Napoleon or that he was Mashiach. What went crazy? So, what does it mean his thought process? What about his thought process? Irrational, right? So he went irrational. Why did he become irrational? See, we have a problem. We don't want to admit this problem. So let's put it out there. Here's the problem. What's that?
Concept of reality.
Exactly. That's our problem. We don't like to admit it. But our problem is that we have decided what reality is. We have decided that reality involves the stock market, the weather forecast, potholes, and load shedding. That's reality. That's what we've decided. That's reality. And if anybody starts to talk to us about deep, meaningful, esoteric things, we say they're nice ideas, but who says they're real? Right? If somebody had to walk into the room right now and start to tell us that the reality of this room is not as you see it. It's actually, if somebody had to walk in now and start saying, I see divine letters, I see the Hebrew alphabet, kind of coding through the walls, we'd tell them what? You're a sugar. Because that's not reality as we know it. Now that's what happened to Ben Azai. He was exposed to the higher reality, which is true, with a capital T. And then he wanted to live in this world, looking through the lens of that reality. And everybody else said, you're Meshuggah. Because then you don't get married. Remember, Ben Azai was the person who didn't want to get married. And then the next thing you know, maybe you don't want to eat, because who's got time for that? And you don't want to talk to people. And so you become a Meshuggah. In other words, the danger of mysticism is that it could replace the way that we look at the world with this spiritual view that doesn't allow us to be functional. That's one of the dangers.
So why are we allowed to learn it?
Who says we're allowed to learn it? I had to say that, coming from a Chabadnik, right? So, okay, I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that question. If there's a danger, it should be locked away. Nobody should ever get near it. Okay, we'll come back to that. Let's look at what happened to benzoma. What happens to benzoma? What happens to benzoma is the fear that none of us has. We don't have to worry about this. None of us is going to open up the Zohar, look inside, or the Sefer Yetzirah, and the next thing, the neshama is going to fly out. Don't worry, we're safe. We're very safe. But what happened to benzoma was this. The neshama, as we know, is compared to a candle. And the expression that we're taught is, if you could imagine that all of our neshamas are like candles, so there's this almost like this central fire that we all come from, because we're also called the spark of Hashem. So there's almost like this, if you can imagine, this massive bonfire. I don't know if you've ever been in Israel for like Boimer. So what happens in Israel? When we were in yeshiva, what they used to do in Kfar Chabad is, on like Boimer evening, they used to drive around in a tractor right through the whole Kfar, and all the kids used to come out of their homes carrying these candles. And you had this massive procession of all the candles until they came to the big central square, which was basically the yeshiva parking lot. And they came to this, and there was this massive bonfire that was set up. Like it was over a story high, the wood. I'm not exaggerating, because we stood on the top floor and you could see eye level, right? And the kids would dance around the bonfire, and then they'd throw the candles into the bonfire, and that's how they lit the bonfire. So there's a principle that's, just picture for a second, if one little candle fell short of the bonfire, what would happen to it? The next thing, it gets caught up, it gets like sucked in. That's what happens. It gets like sucked into the big fire. So in the same way, when you expose the neshama to a tremendous amount of godliness, the neshama gets sucked in. That's what happened to benzoma. That's the danger, that the neshama can no longer remain in this world because it's just so drawn and magnetized to the reality of Hashem. So his neshama was literally pulled out of his body, which for us means he died. Exactly what happened to Aaron's son. That's a great comparison, because if you look at Rashi's description of how Aaron's sons died, what does it say? Rashi tells us some kind of a flame came through their two nostrils and burnt the insides and left the outside intact, which is metaphoric for saying sucked the neshama out of them and left the body behind. So that's what happens to benzoma. Can't reconcile their great spiritual exposure with trying to remain in the reality of this world. Now, Elisha ben Avuya, who's the one we're focused on, has the exact opposite result of the same problem. Can't reconcile. He's been exposed to this massive spiritual reality, and then comes back down to earth and sees, what's earth got to offer? You can't do any of these things. You can't experience any of that holiness. So therefore, why bother? He comes out thinking, we're wasting our time over here. The physical world is a non-starter. It doesn't go anywhere. And now that I've seen what's on the other side, what's there to chaparain over here, kind of thing. And so he goes off the rails. Whereas Rabbi Akiba, who, by the way, holds the key to how we can learn these things, nichnas b'shalom. He enters the experience b'shalom. Now, peace is a very important word. There are other words that we could use, like menucha, which implies tranquility or serenity. Peace is very specific. When is peace relevant? Peace is only relevant in a context where there could be conflict. If there could not be conflict, why would you need peace? So in other words, if a person is in a good space internally, we could say that person is in a state of menucha, in a state of rest. But we wouldn't have to say they're in a state of shalom because they didn't have to have conflict before. Whereas if you have two people or two issues that are at loggerheads, then you need peace. That's why we have the question, how can we say, Oiseh shalom bimroimav, what's the conflict on high that Hashem has to make peace? And the Gemara has to answer, there's two types of angels, and the fire and the water, etc. Rabbi Akiba understands, before you go into the paradise, you have to acknowledge there's going to be conflict. There's going to be conflict between the spiritual and the physical realities. And if you don't go into that experience with an objective of shalom, that our purpose is to harmonize the spiritual and the physical, not to prioritize one over the other. So you have two rabbis who prioritize the spiritual, one who prioritizes the physical, and it's failure on all three counts. So Rabbi Akiba says our goal has to be to harmonize. If you start the process of studying any part of Torah, including the mystical, with a view to harmonize it back into reality in the physical world, then Yatsa B'Shalom, then you come out in peace as well. So what's Elisha ben Avuya's issue? That he could not reconcile the spiritual experience with what he considered to be the physical reality. So he let it all go. Now we'll see how this plays out a little bit in the teaching, not only his teaching, but all the teachings of this Mishnah. Now, many of the commentators ask if Elisha ben Avuya was such a, so to speak, rejected personality, at least at some point was completely rejected, how can we still quote him? We don't quote other people. Right? We don't quote other people who went off the rails. Why is he still in the Mishnah? Because the Ben Azai, benzoma, they weren't bad people. They didn't reject Judaism. They just kind of went off the spiritual deep end. But he rejected Judaism. So how can we still quote him? You know, can you imagine I could think of a few other people who perhaps lived at that time that we would never quote in a million years. So how come he gets quoted? So there are two possible angles on this. The one angle is that this was something he taught before he went sour. So we retain valid information, as the expression goes, kabel es ha'emes mimisha oimroi, that you should accept truth from whoever says it. And at that particular point in time, he wasn't yet off the rails, so that means it was truth, and therefore we have to accept it. In fact, the Gemara says Rabbi Mayer was Elisha ben Avuya's student. So one of the versions at the end of the Mishnah is that Rabbi Mayer is the author, even though the more common, you probably have in your text, Rebbe, but there's an opinion that says it was Rabbi Mayer at the end of the Mishnah. So Rabbi Mayer was a student of Elisha ben Avuya, and the Gemara says Rabbi Mayer found a pomegranate. You got to love how the Gemara speaks in metaphors, right? He found a pomegranate, ate the fruit, and threw away the peel. Meaning to say, he knew how to get from Elisha ben Avuya the value without being contaminated by his skewed views. So Rabbi Mayer remained connected to Elisha ben Avuya for the rest of his life. He used to follow him around, literally. He used to follow him around and used to get him to teach him, even though he was off the rails, because he had been such a brilliant scholar that he knew that inside there was still tremendous wisdom. And if you know how to discern, you can get the wisdom and discard the inappropriateness. Rabbi Mayer also constantly pushed Elisha ben Avuya to do teshuvah. Constantly. I don't mind. So Rabbi Mayer constantly pushed Elisha ben Avuya to do teshuvah. And Elisha ben Avuya told him, you cannot get me to do teshuvah. Now listen to this for a story. I don't know about you, but usually when I hear, or when most of us hear stories about people who've gone off the derech, we don't necessarily hear afterwards that they had amazing spiritual encounters thereafter, right? Elisha ben Avuya says to Rabbi Mayer, he says, I heard them say in heaven. Can you imagine? This is a person who's like thrown it all away. He says, I heard them say in heaven, anybody could do teshuvah except acher. So I heard it myself. So what are you telling me? Anyhow, there's a version in the Gemara that says that at the end, Rabbi Mayer got him to do teshuvah. In which case, it would obviously make sense that we still quote his teachings in the Mishnah. Okay, so it's a fascinating character, right? Fascinating character. Oh, and let's just throw in one last little bit of information just to give us all that parental guilt that we don't already have. So he's called Elisha ben Avuya. So the question is, who's Avuya? Who was this man? Normally people are not quoted in the Mishnah unless they have some kind of caliber, some kind of credentials. Who's Avuya? So the Gemara tells a story that Elisha ben Avuya's father Avuya once had some of the rabbis over. I don't know if it was for a meal or whatever it was, but he spent some time with them, and they were teaching Torah. It was gushing like a flowing river. You can imagine, it was unbelievable, the things that they were sharing and that they were saying, and he was completely blown away. And he said, please God, one day I should have a son who is of the caliber of these rabbis. Now, let's be honest. We'd all be in the same boat, right? We'd all be in the same boat, say, halavai, I should have a child like these rabbis. The Gemara says because he had ulterior motives, because he wanted his son to be like a big rabbi, not because he wanted his son to grow up to be dedicated to Hashem or learn Torah. Can you imagine? It's a hectic story. Because of that, that's why his son ended up going off the rails. Okay? So just in case we ever thought we carry too much parental guilt, here's a story that can really, raise the bar. Okay, so what does Elisha ben Avuya say? This statement of Elisha ben Avuya, there are two girsa'os how you're supposed to read it. The most common girsa goes as follows. Haloi made. Right? Haloi made. What does it say? Yeled. Now the other version is Haloi made Torah Yeled. That makes a big difference. If you're going to read it Haloi made Yeled, then it sounds like when you teach a child. If you read it Haloi made Torah Yeled, then it means a person who learns Torah while young, while a child. Very different possibilities, right? So there's two versions of the Mishnah. Lemohu doime, what do we compare such a person to? Person who either teaches a child or learns while they're a child. Lidiyoi kusuva al niyar chadash, like ink that is written on brand new paper, or in those days it would have been parchment. Fresh take, which makes sense, right? It's a child, impressionable mind, they don't have preconceptions. That's exactly how a child is. So whether you're teaching a child or learning as a child, that would apply. That there's this no prejudice, no bias. They're open to learn. Ve'haloi made, again, two versions, right? Ve'haloi made Zokain, a person who tries to teach an older person, or Ve'haloi made Torah Zokain, the person who only starts to learn Torah when they're older. What is that compared to? Li'dioi ksuva al niyar machuk, like ink that is written on a paper that has been erased. Okay, so at this point in time, we could all feel offended. Because it basically sounds like if you didn't chaperein when people were young, you know the expression, over the hill. That's what it sounds like. Very encouraging, don't you think? Very encouraging, yes? Very encouraging. Okay. Never too late to learn. Elisha ben Avuya doesn't seem to feel that way. And can you see how it fits with his life? Because he very much is that person who says, I'm over the hill, there's nothing I can do. Rabbi Mayer keeps badgering him, do tshuva. And he keeps saying, can't be done. The damage has been done. That's effectively what he's saying, right? That's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like he's saying. Now, what you might notice that's interesting over here is you've got two metaphors that he uses. He uses the ink on new paper, but then he doesn't compare it to ink on old paper. He specifically compares it to ink on erased paper. What's the difference between old paper and erased paper? Surely it's the same thing. Surely if it's old, it's been used before. Why does he specifically say niyar mochuk, that it's been erased, that it's been rubbed out? Okay, something to think about. Also, something to think about is why he doesn't just say it is like writing on new or old paper. He doesn't say that. It says it's like ink on new or old paper, right? Now, it might sound like a nuance, but at the end of the day, surely the act of teaching is like the act of writing, not like the ink that is on the paper. That should be the information that's on the paper. And effectively what he wants to illustrate to us over here is that people need to understand when it comes to learning, you've got the material, which is like the ink, and then you've got the parchment, which is the mind. And of course, you want the two to be indelibly linked into each other. That's what teaching is, or learning, whichever version we go with, is supposed to achieve. That that the information is actually in our minds. Now, what is the challenge of learning when one is older? You would think that the challenge is that you've got preconceptions. That's what you'd think. So the child doesn't. The child has no bias. It's a clean slate. You can write. You know how it is when you write something on a brand new piece of paper. The ink is clear. It stands out. And that's how it is in the child's mind. It's clear. The information is, they're impressionable at that age. We know it's going to stick with them. Whereas what happens when a person is older, there's a lot of other stuff in there. You've got to kind of superimpose this information over other information that a person's already achieved and learned over periods of time and colors their vision. But here's another interesting thing. If you had old paper, it's possible that the old paper might already have writing on it. But even if there's writing on the paper, there's always space where there's no writing. Meaning to say their margins. Ask any child about their set works, their textbooks from school. You see they come back, they've got all their little doodles in the margins, right? So there's always somewhere else that you could write on fresh, clean paper. That's why it says it's like an erased parchment. That means to say if you've ever seen parchment when it's been reworked, like if something's got to be replaced, there's almost like this smudge over the entire area, not just where the words go. Makes the whole thing difficult to write on. And that's the implication over here. When a person is older, there are no gaps really for fresh material. Everything already has a preconception and a bias and so forth.
That's if they're not flexible.
Well, most people unfortunately are not. And we could argue that young and old doesn't have to be age. It could be a young state of mind versus an old state of mind. It's possible, right? As we'll see at the end of the Mishnah. So, but there's another thing. A couple of the Mefarshim point out that really what he wants us to know is when you rub things out, they're no longer there. The problem with the older mind is that it forgets more quickly. Things get rubbed out. Whereas the younger mind, things stick. Okay? So, you don't have to raise your hands if you're feeling uncomfortable with this Mishnah, right? I think we're all kind of uncomfortable with this Mishnah. Well, what's it saying? Are we lost causes? What could we do?
Maybe that's why he says the ink and the writing, because the writing, he's just writing, but the ink stays.
Well, maybe that's exactly the point, right? Is that the ink, in order for the ink to stay, needs to have a good surface in order for it to stay or to be so clear and so on and so forth, right? That's a good point. So let's try and get a little bit out of this uncomfortable place where we find ourselves right now. Where it's like, hang on a second, Elisha ben Avuya doesn't seem to be a fan of people over a certain age. So he has another angle on it completely, which is a very profound angle. The idea of being a Zokain, the Gemara tells us, Zokain, very often, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but very often the Gemara takes Hebrew words and instead of just translating them, actually shows us how the Hebrew word is an abbreviated form of other words. So the word Zokain, the Gemara says, is actually an abbreviation of two words. The Zayin stands for the word Zeh, and the Kuf Nun stands for the word Kana. Zeh Kana. This is someone who has acquired. So based on that, the Gemara says, Zokain, Zeh mi shekana chokhmah. The definition of a Zokain is not age. It's unfortunate, but you could have people who are at a very advanced age, and they're not a Zokain by the Torah's definition, meaning to say they have not yet acquired wisdom. And yet on the other hand, you could have somebody who's a Yeled, who is a young person, and yet they could have a tremendous amount of wisdom. Again, as we'll see in the third part of this Mishnah, which we'll try and still get to today. Seva is age. And that's why Mipnei Seva Takum, to stand up in honor of old age, applies to Jews and non-Jews alike, because it has nothing to do with how much wisdom of Torah they have. Whereas Zokain, V'hadarta Pnei Zokain, that, the second part of the pasuk, that is specifically that you have to give honor to those who have acquired Torah knowledge. So, the Zokain is the person who has knowledge, which is a great thing, but it comes with a particular weakness. The weakness of knowledge is that you have knowledge. What I mean by that? What's worse than a person who doesn't know anything, a person who knows that they know things. Right?
Wisdom is grief and knowledge pain.
Yes. Yes. But in this particular context, the wisdom often precludes us from learning. Because we know. And we have our ideas. Or we think we know, exactly. The yeled, the child, doesn't have this problem. A child doesn't believe that, they don't expect that they should know. So if you ever watch how children learn, they are like sponges. Right? They're like sponges. They take everything in. Because they don't have that sense of, oh, I know this already, right? You can tell them the parasha. That's the nice thing about teaching the younger ages, right? You can tell them the parasha every single year. They don't say, oh, we learned this last year. Okay, wait till the high school. It's a different story. But when they're young, they say, wow, it's like brand new information. The Jews left Egypt. Unbelievable. When did this happen? So the yeled implies not an age, but an innocence. And in order to achieve that innocence when a person is older, the person has to learn a technique that we call bitul hayesh, which means to let go of the self. Let go of the ego. Haloimed Torah yeled. This is what Elisha ben Avuya says. Again from his own experience. If you at any age could still learn with that fresh perspective of a child who doesn't come carrying their ego and their preconceptions, then whatever you learn will be like fresh ink on clean paper. But if a person is loimed Zokain, if a person learns specifically from the perspective of what they know, then whatever they learn is always going to be sullied by what they believe they already know.
So in many ways there's a lack of honesty in a way, because you want to hang on to preconceived ideas.
Correct. As long as a person wants to hang on to what they believe they know, they block the possibility of the integrity of their learning.
But then magic and innocence should be in everyday living.
It should be, right? That's his message. That's exactly his message. So it's a completely different story to what we thought, right? We thought he is saying that this is purely an age thing, and then you think, why on earth would the Torah do that? Rabbi Akiba started at the age of 40. What do you mean? That's exactly the point. Look at Rabbi Akiba. Remember Rabbi Akiba's story? He went at the age of 40 and he sat in the children's classes with that same innocence, or if not innocence, at least the surrender of ego. Not, hey, I'm an adult, I'm going to sit with these kids. And that opened up for him to have the opportunity to learn with that freshness of a child. That's the lesson for us. That every single person is capable of having that experience of learning Torah literally like a child. Now, it's not exactly the same, but it kind of illustrates some of the point. So I'll just use it to illustrate the point. One of the medieval Rishonim, one of the great medieval scholars, used to say this. He used to say, Ani mispalel leda'as ze hatinoik. I want to daven like a child. Now, how does an adult daven and how does a child daven? It's very similar to this principle. How does an adult daven? How does an adult daven? What? Out of their heads, right? Oh, you say oizveinik, right? How does what happens when an adult davens? We're not talking over here about an adult who's unschooled. How does an adult who has information that figures how do we daven? We daven like this. Well, let's be more optimistic. Yes, there are many adults who daven like robots. That's true. I hate to say it. There are many children who do the same. Maybe because they watch the adults. But I'm saying a lot of kids do that. Anybody who is brought up from children has had this conversation at least once in their life. It's not possible you did the whole davening. It's not possible. That quickly it stops. Go daven again. Don't think that the children don't rush through the davening. That's not the difference between their davening and ours. No. It's a more subtle difference. Here's the difference. We daven and we say...
We have a focus.
A focus on what?
On what we say and what we believe.
We have a focus on the words. And we have understanding, and we think we're big deals because we have understanding. For example, what does every one of us want to do before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? We're going to have a whole series on the Machzor. Right? Teach me something that I could meditate on this Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that I've never heard before. So my davening could be at another whole level. Okay, fine. So you go to this course on the Machzor. And what do they teach us in the course on the Machzor? You know why instead of saying HaKel HaKadosh, we say HaMelech HaKadosh? Because Kel represents this dimension of godliness, which is this particular kind of energy, and Rosh Hashanah is the time of a different kind of energy, which is the energy of Melech. So you got to think of Hashem as a king. Normally you think of Hashem maybe as a compassionate father, because Kel, yeah? So you got to now picture in your mind that Hashem is like a king. So you start davening and you get caught up in the word Melech, and you say Melech is a king. Melech HaOlam is a king over the world. And we go through this whole rigmarole of all the various elements that we understand. And if you're really good at it, then you know, Baruch. Let's take a simple bracha, right? Baruch, you start with a Baruch. Baruch means to draw down, as in the Gemara's expression, Amavriches HaGefen, which is when a person stimulates the growth of a vine by pulling the vine back into the ground. Baruch, you're bringing down godliness. Atah, you can speak to Hashem directly, right? And then you realize, no, hang on a second, that's not possible. I'm nowhere near Hashem, so you've got to go back to third person, Hashem. And what's Hashem? Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. That's the name of godliness that transcends the world, where past, present, and future are all rolled into one. And then Elokeinu. Elokim is the name that represents nature and represents din, but it's Elokeinu. It's our God, so it's personal to us. Melech HaOlam is the king of the whole world. But by the time you've done all of that, so one bracha, and you think now we're floating, we're flying, this is amazing. I'm just speaking about Hashem and all the different energies and the levels and the this and that, whatever.
Too much overthinking.
Exactly. We're overthinking. How does a child daven? Hashem. Hashem, that's all. I don't need details. I don't need addresses. I don't need titles. Hashem. Hashem is the ultimate. That's all I have to know. You don't have to tell me, which word is which level and you say this bracha first and then that bracha, but straight. So this particular individual said, I'd like to daven like a child. Elisha ben Avuya is telling us the same thing about learning. To learn like a child. We don't have to overcomplicate everything. So, have you ever seen, some people are like this. The minute you say anything, they say, I know exactly which one, they bring something else. It's unrelated. So, the person can learn Torah like a child. With that openness. With a lack of ego. That's Diyoy Ksuva al Niyar Chadash. Every bit of Torah that person learns will be clear and distinct from every other piece of Torah, so that you have clarity, not this blurring of ideas, which unfortunately often happens to us. Stop blurring ideas, and we start cross-sectioning things that shouldn't be cross-sectioned. You have that clarity. Torah is Zokain, whereas if a person learns Torah specifically coming with all the baggage of all the things that they've already learned before, then it's one big mishmash, and it feels like you keep rewriting things over other things until eventually nothing actually makes any sense. So purity and an ability to let go of ego. So we're not coming here to impose ourselves on the Torah, but rather to open ourselves to the Torah, and that way we could learn properly. Okay, I thought we'd get to the next two parts of the Mishnah, but with 1 minute of the time left, I don't think we'll do that. We'll have to be, please God, next time. So, Mitzvah Hashem.